My name is Michael Goldberg. I am the Executive Director of our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve, and I also teach in the business school at Weatherhead. And welcome to our speaker series. And if it's an alumni, we call it, it's the Alumni Speaker Series. So today it's our Alumni Speaker Series. It's great to have Adity back in our Case community. So today's session will be moderated by Connor Nally, who's also working in the automotive space. And Connor was a student of mine in a couple of classes and is back working remotely. I guess you're officially graduating this weekend. So congratulations,
Sunday, yep.
Connor. And then so I can't call you a student anymore, starting next week. We have a nice sort of small group here. This is going to be really participatory. It's going to be sort of Connor's show to run and entertain questions. And we really do encourage those that are on with Zoom. And then there's a number of people that are watching on Facebook Live to either just raise your hand, your sort of virtual hand or real hand, and let Connor know you have a question. You can put it in the chat. And for those who are on Facebook Live, just put something in the chat, and Doug and I will be monitoring the chat, and we'll make sure that Connor gets the question. So with that, let me turn it over to Connor. And Aditi, thank you so much for doing this today.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, everybody. Like Professor Goldberg said, I'm Connor Nally. I'm graduating on Sunday from Case. I studied finance at Weatherhead. And I'm starting work at Rivian, which is an automotive startup based out of Detroit. And I'm happy to have Aditi here. Before we get into it, I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy. And I'll just hand it off to Aditi and let her kind of give an intro and just talk through her experience at Case and maybe just a quick rundown of her positions. And then we can get into some deeper questions. And like Professor Goldberg said, if you guys have anything you want to contribute, any questions you want to ask, feel free to just butt in or type in the chat or whatever.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Connor. Hi, everyone. My name is Adity Sharma. I'm a 2009 biomedical engineering graduate and a 2010 master's in engineering and management graduate from Case. Right after Case, or right after MEM, I had a startup, a medtech device startup that didn't do so well. And from there, I went into venture capital for a bit. And then from there, I went into corporate venturing and corporate innovation at Goodyear in Akron, Ohio. Did that for a few years. And then from there, I joined Honda Innovations, which is my latest role, where I'm a program manager looking at different verticals. So my vertical focus include automotive, autonomous, and ADAS technologies, manufacturing related technologies, and robotics, fintech, and then HMI for Honda and any of its related product lines. I also have a geographical focus, which happens to be East Coast and Canada. So I spend a lot of my time in those two areas looking at technologies and figuring out how we can bring those technologies and collaborate with them in-house to enhance our capabilities and add to our product portfolio. And my most recent role is more on the acquisition, so M&A, and then investment side as our team starts shifting its focus. So starting to look more at opportunities, not just from how we can collaborate with the startup, but also what's worth buying, what's worth partnering, what's worth investing in. And so putting that hat on as we do our scouting activities. So it's a really brief overview. Obviously, none of this is a straight line, all very squiggly, going from biomedical engineering to automotive, and lots of dips and thoughts and pauses along the way, but all added to all part of the journey.
Great. So yeah, you've got we spoke a little bit last Friday, and you've got a really interesting array of experiences and being based in the Midwest in venture and then working in corporate and trying to get a product launched. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but I guess the most obvious question is, how is the company handling the current COVID-19 crisis, and how have things changed? Obviously, you're remote. and just kind of what are your outlooks for the next couple of months to next year?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that's a question that we're asking ourselves too in real time. For us, our manufacturing came to a complete halt when COVID started around March 11th. And we've just started resuming activities. And in that time, from March to May, we really took a pause to figure out what can we do to safely reopen. And we've really reached out to the startup ecosystem in our network to see which companies have we been engaging with that have pivoted. So looking at robotics companies that traditionally would do material handling, how have they started thinking about like contact tracing or temperature monitoring, and would it make sense for us to bring those in for as we start doing a limited and soft open? So we've been talking to a lot of these companies that have shifted their focus to address problems right now. And then looking at broader trends, right? Like if we look at charts in the in venture funding over the last 10 years, it's very evident that funding in autonomy has gone down. And if you look at articles, like this was supposed to be the year that autonomy really kind of brought itself to the market. But that's completely on hold right now, and that might not come back for another 3 years. So we're starting to ask ourselves, well, what should we be focusing on? Where are the opportunity areas? And do we need to go back to the basics? And if so, how do we approach that? Also looking at the market and thinking about, well, what will customers want going forward? Because right now there is not a lot of transportation that's happening given everyone's sheltering in place. Also, people might not want, shared automotive. People don't want to ride in an Uber. So from 2009 to 2020, what gave rise to gig economy no longer is relevant. And it might not be for a while going forward. So how do we shift our focus in that way? So we're still a work in progress. We're starting to create a point of view from that frame of mind. And we're starting to ask ourselves the hard questions like, do we see an uptick in car sales because people want to ride in their own vehicles? And how do we prepare for that? I read a quote that said like every company now is a digital company, and that's very true for us. So we were trying to take our sales online for a long time, and it happened overnight for us. So, we're adjusting to that, and we're trying to figure out, well, what else do we need to bring online to make sure that Honda stays a viable business and stays competitive, provides the same quality and same kind of products that Honda is known to provide. We're looking, it's a very multifaceted problem, and we're looking at it from all different angles.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because you look at the automotive industry over the last few years, and it's starting to pivot to kind of autonomous and ride sharing, and then all of a sudden you've got this thing that's just completely turned it on its head. So that's definitely an interesting point. So thank you for that. So I guess getting into it, and you kind of glossed over at the beginning that you worked at Jumpstart right out of school. And I think it would just be interesting for everybody to hear about your experience there and kind of what differences you've noticed from operating in venture in the Midwest at a angel fund versus now what you're doing with Honda, and just kind of compare and contrast and talk through maybe your growth and experiences at these positions.
Yeah, so Jumpstart was, given that it was my first real job out of college, it was a foundational job. It was really giving me, it was like starting a fire for me, really. I was gathering a lot of sticks and trying to figure out, how do I light this fire? Because I had I had tools, and I knew the components that I needed to build a fire, but I didn't really know, with what intensity the fire would be. And that, when I use that analogy, it's more to really illustrate that, like, I didn't know a lot about venturing. I didn't know what it takes to build a startup. I didn't know what it means to get funding. I had a glimpse of it when I was working on my medical device, but I didn't really know what it meant to be an entrepreneur, really. That it was just like, I knew what a CEO was. I knew you build something and you get it out in the market, but That's all I knew. And really, Jumpstart helped me like open this like door of curiosity where I started to ask questions about like, why should I fund this company? What is it? What makes it different? Why is it unique? Is there, why would people pay for something like this? Like all these questions that you generally ask yourself silently when you're buying a product, but when you're on the investor side of things, you really have to look into why. And there's so many whys you have to answer before you get comfortable and saying, let's put some money in it and see where it goes. It was also a good juxtapose to my small taste in entrepreneurship of being a startup, part of a startup, where I didn't really know why my product wasn't doing well. I didn't know why nobody believed in it quite like I believed in it. And it made me realize, like, when I sat on the other side of the table, like, yeah, this makes way more sense why nobody wanted to fund us in the same way, why nobody had the same, like, belief in it that I did. Because I didn't have all the parts and pieces. And I wasn't asking the same type of questions. I wasn't looking at it from the same frame of mind. And nor should one, right? Like investors look at it very different than entrepreneurs do, but having that opposite perspective really helped me like understand building a startup and funding a startup. They're complementary, but they require very different types of questions that you have to ask yourself. And Jumpstart would do smaller rounds of funds, and I. Part of my time at Jumpstart, I used to work at North Coast Angel Fund, which is also very different because those are, a bunch of angels that come together and decide if they want to invest in a company or not. And the way they, their mandate is different than than Jumpstart's mandate was. So talking to a lot of those angels and trying to understand like why should we invest in some of these companies was also like sometimes it was overwhelming because here's 3 different perspectives, but all very relevant and all very necessary at different stages of a startup's life. Contrasting that to my time here in the Valley, it's very different because it just moves a lot faster. So diligence at North Coast Angel could take 6 months to a year. Or even more. Like we would look at a company for a very long time and maybe we invest, maybe we don't. Here, diligence takes very little time. People sometimes meet an entrepreneur 4 or 5 times and say, yeah, we want to invest because the space is just moving that much faster. Also, capital is just easier to come by. And I use that loosely, but I think there's a lot more people that are willing to be a lot more bullish and say, yeah, I'm going to put like $500,000 in this, see where it goes. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Whereas $500,000 in the Midwest carries a lot more weight, goes a lot farther, and has a lot more diligence behind it. That was then. The landscape obviously has changed now. I think there's a lot more activity and there's a lot more, there's a greater appetite for venturing. That people are seeing that this is a really this is a fast moving space, and with big exits like Cover My Meds and Root Insurance and companies like that really bringing the Midwest to the forefront, I think people are starting to free up capital easier in the Midwest. That wasn't the case before. And my last point to that would be, when I was at Jumpstart, a lot of our focus was on med tech. Because that industry, because of Cleveland Clinic, and because of a lot of what's coming out was related to medical technologies. And so that does take a lot longer. You have to have more diligence. The process is longer. Whereas in the Valley, there is med tech. I don't focus on it right now, but a lot of fast innovation happens in hardware and software, which is sometimes easier to deploy, try, and get out in the market. And so, it's different, but I think the landscape has changed tremendously from when I was at Jumpstart to my time now. And I think I'm seeing this shift in like, even how I think about like, yeah, let's just try something for, X amount of dollars. And there's more, corporates are more willing to play, traditional entities that you wouldn't hear of, like, Anthem having a CVC function that's looking to try different things, or traditional companies that usually wouldn't think about working with startups are starting to become more agile in that way.
Great. So just a quick follow-up, and then I'll see if anybody else has any questions to ask. So you mentioned you work for the Angel Fund and Jumpstart, and then you moved to Honda, who's a global corporation with, tons of capital, tons of product offerings. Maybe if you could talk a little bit to how it differed operating in this new Honda setting versus Jumpstart, which is more of a regional type of corporation.
So it's different because, well, one is a corporate function. And the challenge is that, at Honda, even though I'm part of Honda Innovations, we're like a standalone entity, and our team has to act like a startup, because what we're doing with other startups in the ecosystem is we're doing quick pilots, trying, and then moving it on to our customer, which is our internal stakeholder. Traditionally, that's where our value came from, is to be able to find a need internally, match it, try it, and then see if it's something that's worthy of moving into our R&D division. So with that regards, like at Honda, we try to operate with the same kind of speed. We try not to have that same, that unfortunate slowness that large corporates get. And we don't have an unlimited budget. We have a set amount of budget that we need to make sure that we're prioritizing, and we're trying as much as we can, because we want to be able to move the needle internally. And so a lot of my work is talking to internal stakeholders and trying to figure out where do these new technologies that we're finding fit. And then the other part of my job is understanding, there's so much in the ecosystem. There are certain spaces that are very cluttered and they're very noisy, trying to take out the noise and figure out what actually holds muster. Where is the value in this space, and who's doing something that actually is unique and differentiated. And so that takes a lot of just understanding the technology and figuring out, creating a metric for how do we create this differentiation. At Jumpstart, like I said, since it was my first job, it was me just trying to understand the space. It was just me learning a lot more than actually doing, which was very helpful because I didn't know a lot. I didn't have a point of view. I was developing my point of view at that point. Now I think because of the volume of companies that we see, and because of the amount of people internally and externally that I get to talk to, I have a point of view, and I can create one relatively quickly based on the data points I have. And when I don't have a point of view, I'm able to rely on my engineering team, or my what we call our synergy team, which are engineers from Japan, to help us get that point of view. And so it's a different way of operating. It's not as foundational anymore. It's more of I've built on the Jumpstart foundation, and my thinking has developed a lot more since that time.
Very cool. All right. I'm going to pause and see if anybody else wants to type in the chat or jump on the mic and ask a question. Go ahead.
You're okay if I go ahead?
Yeah,
okay.
Go for it.
So I have a question about, so I mentioned in the beginning, I work in the tech transfer office here at CASE. So we are commercializing technologies, licensing to companies, and starting companies. So we do the CASE startups. And as far as I know, we haven't worked with Honda Innovations, but I would just be curious, can you give some examples, just some of the things that Honda Innovations would invest in? You mentioned faster moving technologies, non-medical, more on the software side, but are there ways that CASE could work with Honda, maybe some, non-traditional things that you've invested in, and have you worked with Case?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I haven't worked with Case in the past, but I've definitely talked to, I've talked to like Bob Sopko, and he's introduced me to a few. And at CES, I see the Case team that's always at the Startup Pavilion, and it's always exciting to see the companies that do have their booths there. And Honda is just starting to do investments in general. And typically in the past, what we've done is we've done proof of concepts, which vary in length, in budget, in just the scope. So I think that's still our mode of operation. We would love to do POCs if there's a relevant technology. Like one that always stands out in my mind is, I remember there was a company while I was there that was using non-Newtonian fluid to cover potholes. I'm not really sure what happened to them, but that I thought was a very interesting idea, very relevant to automotive and in general transportation, because that's a really big problem in many parts of the country. And so it's always interesting to meet unique startups like that are trying to do something that seemed very simple, like cornstarch is a non-Newtonian fluid. It like really solves a basic problem without a lot of money. And it was a really interesting concept. We've talked to a company in the past and really like the guy called FGC Plasma. He went to Case, very interesting technology, very high tech. And he's solving a very hard problem. And so in that capacity, we've engaged with different startups. There's another one, Path Robotics in Columbus, again, another Case alum, also solving a very hard problem in automotive and welding and autonomy. So there's some really interesting technology coming out of Case, and would love to engage further. I'm always trying to find that connection that we can make, and to be able to see if we can help provide learnings to the startup as well as internally, and see if there's a good marriage between technology and corporate. So if there's anything interesting that's coming across your way, we'd love to engage.
Yeah, one more follow-up to that. Do you ever, so you're talking mostly about startups, do you invest in technologies or licensed technologies? And have you ever tried doing something where you contact a university and tell them what your needs are? Because a lot of times I think there are technologies available that can address needs of a company, but they just haven't been disclosed yet. So that might be a way to work with Case as well.
So we haven't. We occasionally, like with Stanford, they'll send us research reports. Like they give us a newsletter that talks about research that's happening in different departments, and we occasionally we reach out if there's something that's relevant that we know. Like all of my team members, we all have an internal list per our vertical of open needs that we have. And that we're constantly matching towards. So when we come across something that we're like, oh, this might be useful, we reach out to the Stanford team just because they're publicizing to us. What we have done, we don't exactly go out to tech transfer offices and say these are our needs list, but we have worked with entities that take tech transfer licenses and turn them into companies. And so those are very, like, we engage quite a bit with those because they have a formal structure. And if we do progress further down the line, we have a standalone entity that, we can engage with, because it's harder for us to untie the technology from the university if it should be of interest. So we like to engage more with the standalone entity rather than seeking the licenses. But that's not like a never statement. I'm sure if something very compelling came along, there would be exceptions to be made.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody else have a question? I saw Professor Goldberg just jumped on the mic.
Anybody else before I jump in? Brandon, Raghav, anyone else? All right, you're on the spot. You can think of your question after my question. Consider yourself warned. So I want to transition a little bit just to the global nature of your employer. I mean, obviously, Honda has deep roots and ties in the US, including in Ohio. I'm sort of curious the dynamics of doing the work that you're doing, but sitting outside of the country where the headquarters are, and kind of how do you find, from a communications point of view, from an autonomy point of view, and even maybe now in this current world that we're in, where we're all doing everything remotely, how has that changed at all? Kind of the way that you're working with colleagues, I guess, both with your team in California, but also with the kind of home base in Japan?
Yeah, so it's interesting because prior to COVID, my team was like an ultra traveling team. Like we would almost never be in the office. I was telling Connor when we spoke before this that, I would be on a plane every 2 weeks because we would be attending so many different things, and we'd be in Japan maybe once a quarter to be able to sync with our colleagues there. Our team here in Silicon Valley would host these. We would take a bunch of startups to Japan to be able to introduce the startup technology directly to our counterparts in Japan and in R&D. So we'd host like a week-long session that way. We were doing so much travel that that's how we covered the globe. And I have colleagues, like one that covers Israel, one that covers Europe, one that covers China, to be able to help us do a lot of the deal sourcing. But those are large spaces to cover themselves. So a lot of my team would be flying in and out to help support them. And then there's a lot of evening calls, and there's a lot of just teleconferencing to be able to make sure that a lot of the POCs that are in progress or the needs that we're sharing is happening on a continuous basis outside of our scouting and our traveling activities. Post-COVID, given that we've come to a screeching halt, this has been, in a way, a breath of fresh air, because we've had to force ourselves to regroup and think of what's actually necessary in terms of travel, and think of before it was we thought face-to-face meetings were the only way we could actually communicate with our counterparts in Japan or in China or in Europe. Now we've actually tried to accommodate. Our workday has gotten longer, but we're starting to figure out just what we can do without having to be physically there. And it's also helped that a lot of the conferences and stuff we go to are going virtual. So we're not, you don't feel as if you're not going to meet anyone or you're not being introduced enough. And the other thing is we've started tapping into our VC network a lot more, because it's easier to get deal flow that way. So it's been just a lot more communication and calling people that you would otherwise meet once a year, just having more of a quarterly cadence with them. So it is a lot more work. It's a lot more talking, and it's a lot more just communication, but it's actually helped us find clarity in how we communicate and how we operate. Because, there were times when we'd fly for one day to Japan and come back. And now in retrospect, it's that's crazy. That's not even necessary anymore. So it's really shifted our perspective.
Very cool. Yeah. Does anybody else have a question they want to ask? Yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
All right. I was wondering if you could talk about the competition right now within the automotive industry. Right now it seems really hard time to be able to innovate, especially when there's so many barriers. We see that there's like Tesla, who's trying to reopen factories and trying to restart production. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the ways that you're trying to stay ahead of the competition, some ways that you're trying to still function properly pre-COVID.
Yeah, so I don't quite think that there's a way of functioning pre-COVID in the same way. Definitely we try, but I think everyone's adopting a new mindset. But, in terms of competition, I think there's tiers, right? In automotive, there's a luxury tier, there's the mid-market, and then there's like the affordable or like the economical market. And I think that there's a lot of cross pollination that's happening, meaning like, traditionally Honda is a very like Honda, Toyota, Ford, they all develop vehicles that fit a certain budget and a certain type of economy. And then they have their luxury tier, like the Acura brand, or I don't even know the other company's names. But they have their luxury tier, and I think that everyone is trying to develop technology that can transcend the verticals, that can transcend the product lines. And I think that's where the innovation is happening. It's less about it's less about the actual car, like the car itself, but it's more now going down to like the feature level. When we think about perception, path planning, sensors, what's on board, what can we fit in terms of like the sensors, the stack that we can provide for different price points. We're trying to figure out what makes sense for that price point, because if I'm a 20-something-year-old and I want to buy a car, I can't afford a BMW or a Mercedes, but my first car was a Honda. It's reliable, it's going to last me 20 years, and you know what, that's going to do a really good job for me, and it's a really safe car. Same for a Toyota. Those are cars that like you can trust as a brand. But I want something extra. I want that flash. I want that Civic R-Type that makes me look cool and makes a noise when I arrive. So those are definitely like, there's definitely innovation in that space. And how can we add feature sets but stay within the price point to be able to still serve the market that we've served and continue to expand in? And then, like companies like Tesla, they're doing something radically different. They are not your traditional car company. You're driving a computer. And there's definitely competition in that space when you look at like Porsche and their fully electric car, or Audi e-tron. Those are all cars that are competing with that space. But even then, I think that there's, it's totally different. The approach is different. The infrastructure is different. And I think it takes like a full view, because if you look at how Tesla has created itself and positioned itself, it has the charging infrastructure. It has that like finesse and polish where like you can get updates over the air. You don't have to change your car every 2-3 years for it to feel new. And it feels and rides like, a really high-end car. Like I can get a really, like the handling and the drive and the speeds are really great. Which, other companies that traditionally are known for that speed and handling when they go electric, they haven't been able to provide. Like I not sure if you read automotive news, but like I think it was Porsche engineers that drove a Tesla. They were like, wow, this drives like butter with the speeds that they wanted, So like when you hear reports like that, you realize like the differentiation in the product has come from innovation in that way. For us, it's different, right? Like we're not trying to, like Honda is not trying to be like a Mercedes-Benz or a Porsche Cayenne. But there's a lot of technology overlap and a lot of technology adoption from the sensor level, from the safety features, like the ADAS features. I think those are still integrated into Honda. And that's where that's where we're looking for innovation, because we serve a different market than those other companies do. When you sit in an Acura, the fit and finish is really nice, and it still feels like a high-end car. It drives really robustly. And again, like the different types of sensors and equipment that's put in is different. The challenge, though, the problem in the automotive space innovation is we plan for car model years out. Like right now, we're doing 2030. That's a really long time out. So what's being developed now, like if we come across a startup that's like doing hardware, we pick a hardware now, in 10 years, that's going to progress significantly. But the planning for it is happening now. So that's the challenge, right? Like innovation now will look radically different than innovation in model year 2028, model year 30. And so that's what makes it difficult for a lot of the automotive players to be able to, to really push the envelope, because unless it's software, it's really hard to bring it down. It's really hard to implement in like a 2022 model year car, because that planning happened 5-6 years ago.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, before I go on, anybody else? That was a great answer. I think we're certainly at a crossroads in the automotive industry, and just, seeing which direction companies go is pretty interesting, with Toyota choosing to hold on to hybrid and then everyone else trying to go full electric. Yep. And definitely an interesting time to be in the automotive industry.
Right.
Allison, I saw you just jumped on camera. Did you want to ask something, or are you just giving us a aquarium view for now?
No, I do have a question. So I guess I'm more curious about how you managed to pivot from a medical device startup to these different functions, because I know professionally sometimes I've felt pigeonholed. Everyone assumes that I do nothing but medical devices, but would love to figure out how to branch out a little more in the innovation world, because as an IP attorney working primarily with small companies and startups, I kind of see everything.
Yeah.
So I would just like to learn a little bit more about your journey.
Yeah, sure. So it's, like I said, it's a windy road, and it continues to be a windy road. So honestly, when I was graduating with my biomedical engineering degree, I didn't quite have like a direction that I knew for sure I wanted to go in. Like I thought about law for a while. I thought about medical school for a bit. I just didn't know. But there's like one thing I knew is I didn't want to do research. I'm a very instant gratification type person, and knew like there was no way that line was going to be for me. So when I thought about like all these different areas, I was like, well, I don't quite know yet. And that's when I said, let me get a master's and figure out like what's the management side of things, because that's the only thing I hadn't really explored. And when I was at my MEM program, I came across biodesign, and biodesign really took me down this path of understanding design, like traditional design. Like when people say user-centered design, like I'd never ever like even come across that. I don't know why. I just never thought of asking the user, what do they want, and figuring out who is my user. I just thought you build something and you put it out in the market. And that was kind of like I was just so fascinated with it that the marriage of the two made a lot of sense. And then when I was, after Jumpstart, I took this course that Michael taught. I audited it for a few weeks, and I realized like I like user design thinking and design thinking and all that, but at the core, I'm still an engineer. At the core, I still want to build things, but those are great tools for my toolbox. And so every job I approached after Jumpstart, it was by just saying, foundationally, all jobs are very similar. It's about the mindset. It's about thinking. And it's about taking a problem and figuring out how to solve it. And so for me, biomedical engineering is thinking about the problem and trying to solve it. It's just in medicine, or it's medically related. In automotive, still my problem exists. Like, how does an autonomous car drive autonomously? My problem is I need to be able to see, I need to be able to know my unknown objects, I need to be able to have a path planning, tool, I need to have sensors, I need to have redundancy. Okay, that's how do I get to my solution? Manufacturing, I need a robot to work indoors. That's my problem. How do I get it to work? So again, it's like I just took my engineering tool set and I said, like, foundationally, this is how I'm using it. It doesn't matter how I apply it and in what areas I apply it. And honestly, like, every day is a learning, every day, right? For me, like, when I look at the fintech space, since I spend a lot of my time looking at fintech companies, it's a problem and solution type situation. Like, I have to like deconstruct a startup and say, at the core, what is the technology they're using? Who are they using it for? Why? And is the user actually using it? And I did that in biomedical engineering. When you're doing your senior year thesis, why would somebody want a pill box? What is the problem you're trying to solve with the new pill box you're creating? And how do you increase adoption of taking a pill every day? So that's really how I approach every job after Jumpstart, is saying, like, as an engineer, I have the ability to take a problem, deconstruct it, and then get back to its solution. And then you layer on information about that space. And really, that's how I approached all my interviews, and that's how I really, and at the end of the day, it's about how curious are you about a certain field. Are you willing to go down a rabbit hole to learn as much as you can, and then emerge by saying, like, I know enough where I can ask, smart questions to add to my knowledge base. And then creating a network around you that's smarter than you, that can help you answer those questions. Because I rely on my engineers so much. They're really good. They're really excellent at what they do. And they help us build these POCs. So they really know the ins and outs of a lot of this. And they help me understand when I don't know, which is 90% of the stuff, that they're my go-to people. So just approaching it in that way.
Awesome, thank you. Because you just described a lot of my days working with clients, right? Trying to do kind of the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, anybody else, or you want me to keep moving with a couple more questions? All right, so you talked a little bit about, you touched on product development there, and sounds like you're something that you're still very passionate about. And I think we haven't really touched much on your experience at Goodyear and kind of what you were tasked with there and trying to bring a product from Europe over to the United States. So if you could just talk about that a little bit for everybody. I thought that was a really interesting thing we talked about earlier this week.
Yeah, so at Goodyear, I joined the business model innovation team. And again, it was in an effort to get back to building something. And so at Goodyear, one of the projects that I was given was to build, Goodyear had already launched a tire monitoring service in Europe, and they wanted to launch that into the US market. And so I was asked to lead the development of the tire monitoring service in the States. Again, it wasn't a lone effort. Heavily guided with the European team and a lot of engineers at Goodyear who helped doing that work. But one of the things that I came into that project thinking was, they've done this in Europe. All we need to do is move it over. It can't be that hard. And that couldn't have been farther from the truth, because, when we started, we picked 2 customers to try this technology, this European technology, their fleet. We chose 2 fleets to try this technology on. And I learned a few things. And this user-centered design, or this design thinking methodology, was very, very critical in understanding the customer, the market, and the reasons it didn't work as smoothly. And the thing was that when we took the technology from Europe to the United States, we installed it on these vehicles, we sent the vehicles out, and we were monitoring them. And we were monitoring them to see when tires on these long haul trucks that you see on the highway, when they would be having these leaks, slow or fast leaks. And why we're looking at that is because when they have leaks, it can cause problems where they can miss their delivery time, or they can have a blowout on the side of the road, which is very costly. So if we can alert them that there's a slow leak or a fast leak happening, they can pull over, address it, and get back on the road, and it costs much less. What I learned was the long haul trucking industry is super. It's a very difficult industry because they're so used to working a certain way. Truckers are not technologists. They definitely use a ton of technology on board, but they're what's the nicest way of saying this? They're just regular people that want to drive a truck. That's it. They want to drive from point A to point B. Secondly, the operators of these fleets, one of the sites we showed up on, they were using MS-DOS. In 2013, they were using MS-DOS, and our jaws were floored. We were like, what is that? Is that a dot matrix printer? So we couldn't put in software there without doing development. And then lastly, a lot of these truck drivers don't want to be followed. So what they would do is they would cut the wire cable, and our tracking unit would go offline. So we had like 30 of the 50 units that we'd installed go offline. How can we do tracking if we don't know where they are and we don't know what's happening? So I spent a lot of my time just tracking these trucks and figuring out where they are, how we can get them back online. And I spend a lot of my time understanding, why don't these drivers want to have this unit on their truck? It's essentially going to help them make money because they're going to get to their end destination in time. Also, talking about targeting the wrong customer, we thought we were very smart in providing the service to fleet managers who are looking at fleet board and seeing where all the vehicles are. But actually, our target audience should have been the drivers, because they're the ones utilizing this technology while they're in transit. And so it took a lot of errors and fixing and a lot of back and forth to understand the customer first, and then trying to get them to understand that this is not a Big Brother watching type technology. And then finally launching a service by saying here's the economical benefit of it. And lastly, in launching the service, the internal stakeholders at Goodyear were really afraid that would reduce tire sales. So we had to combat them as well, because they didn't, their metric is how many tires do they sell a year. And so trying to understand how do we make them understand that technology, even though we're selling less tires, over time we're selling more tires because they have dependency on Goodyear. Anyway, long story short, it was just a lot of trying to understand a customer set that I'd never had to work with, and trying to create a product that that the European market had successfully launched, but the North American market, it's a very saturated place with companies like Qualcomm and a whole host of others that deploy all these sensors on trucks to be able to track. And we were just one of those players. So right around the time that it launched into the States, I left Goodyear. And I don't know what happened to the service thereafter, but I spent two years just trying to understand a very different type of customer set, a very different type of technology, and figuring out how do we have a successful launch? How do we ship a product that actually has adoption and that users see benefit from? And that's sometimes the hardest part of creating creating something new, is when you introduce it into the market, you have to see how the users react to it. How do people use it? And then trying to change according to the behavior patterns that you're seeing.
Awesome. Yeah, I have one last question before I'm going to hand it back over to Professor Goldberg. And this is totally different from everything else we've talked about today. But when we spoke last Friday, it seemed like networking was something that you were pretty passionate about and something that helped you along the way. And I know Professor Goldberg loves his networking. So if you could just talk a little bit about that and how that helped kind of guide your career path, that would be great.
Yeah. Networking is a necessary evil. It's really uncomfortable when you're starting out and when you're doing it and you're building your network. The benefits of college is you get a ready-made network amongst your friends, which you can tap into and you can always rely on. But when you're working and you have to create a new network, for me, moving from the Midwest to the West Coast, I had to create a new network from scratch. It's very uncomfortable, but it's one that pays dividends later on in life, where once you start creating this resource pool that you can tap into and you're feeding it, it's like sourdough starter. You have to feed it quite often. You have to make sure that you're doing it methodically, because not all network connections are going to, not all network connections need to be live at all times. There's ones that come online, come offline. You sync once in a while. You drop off, for a while with other ones. But one thing I've learned from my time at Honda has been that, and it's one that I'm still building. My network is not quite as robust as I'd like for it to be, but 2 years, it took a lot of going out there, meeting people, just having them understand who I am, understanding who they are, and trying to find a node of commonality. You don't always achieve that with everyone you meet, and it's hard, right? Because they're not people they're not your friends or friends of friends. They're often just people you meet at an event or something. But now slowly what I've learned is there's some people in my network that are starting to give back to me, because I fed it enough where now I'm starting to see they'll come across an interesting company that they know would be relevant for me. Or I know, we see some company and we can't do anything with them, but we think they're total rock stars and we'll move it on to somebody else. When startups tell us they're fundraising and we can't do anything, but we know other people might be able to help them. It's those kinds of things where the network really starts working for you and you don't have to work so hard on your own. It takes a village, especially when you're a startup. It takes a village to get things going. It takes a village when you're a CVC. It takes a village no matter who you are and what stage in life you are. And I think, network, if you have a strong and good network that you can tap into, it makes life so much nicer and easier. And you really get to learn a lot more than if you were to try to do it on your own sometimes. And I've definitely benefited from my case network, from Michael, having a network, and eventually some of those people in the network turn into mentors, and mentors turn into North Stars that you end up, really helping create the path for your career. It takes a while.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was a great conversation, a lot of great insight, and I'm going to turn it back over to Professor Goldberg.
Thanks so much, Connor.
I guess you can call me Michael starting on Monday. Well, great. Connor, thank you for moderating. It's been great to have you as a student. It's fun to have you in this moderating role. This is, I think, one of the pleasures of this series, and the decision to kind of stick our students in the moderating role as being, it's fun seeing their growth, and it's a new skill set. And so great job, Connor. And Aditya, thanks for reconnecting. It's fun. In some ways, the theme of networking, these kind of opportunities to connect back with you. And I mean, I've followed your career, and obviously when you were in Northeast Ohio, we would see each other and get caught up, and it's exciting to see what you're doing at Honda. We have 2 Hondas. I'm a 2 Honda family.
Oh, thank
2 out of
you.
3. So
we appreciate the patronage.
So next week, and so for those that are joining on Zoom and online, these are continuing, and we're going to keep doing them all summer. I actually mentioned to Aditi as we were sort of getting set up that we've got a program so for anybody who's watching, if you want a case student potentially to work with you this summer on an internship project, an entrepreneurship project, we're busy placing and actually doing a lot of networking right now because so many students are caught without internships this summer. So we're doing that. And then as part of our students, and I know there's a number of students that are on here, some of which are working on this in the program, we're just continuing this session. So next week we have 3 speakers. Jack Daly, who's a super interesting guy, speaking on Tuesday at 1 o'clock. He's with TPG, so Texas Pacific Group, large private equity fund, spent a number of years at Goldman Sachs. And actually, before he went to Wharton for business school, was a faculty member at Case. So he kind of flip-flopped what I did. I worked in the private sector, went to Wharton, and then started doing this, and Jack did it the other way around. So we'll have Jack in conversation with Rishi, who's one of our students, on Tuesday at 1. Another person who's focused on investing, Sean Gandhi from North Pond Ventures, will be joining us on Wednesday at 1 o'clock. And then Thursday, actually, it wasn't intended to be this week. It's all sort of venture capital investing week. We have Tim Schigel, who's a partner of Refinery Ventures, is going to join us on Thursday at 1 o'clock. And then we're back the following week with some interesting programming. So keep checking if you don't see all of our programming, like Stephanie, who we hadn't quite communicated all of our things. Either check our Facebook page, email me, tweet at me, find me, and we'll make sure that you know about our programming, because we'd love to have more of you guys joining us. So with that, Aditi, thank you again for doing this. Hope to see you in person at some point soon back on campus. And thank you for taking the time to connect with us.
Thanks for having me. This was really great.
Right. Very good. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you.